Hello everyone, and welcome to today's Pedestrian Focus webinar, sponsored by the Federal Highway Administration's Office of Safety and the Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center. Today's webinar is entitled Road Diets and Pedestrian Safety, and we'll be speaking with Libby Thomas, a research associate at the UNC Highway Safety Research Center, Jenna Kaufman, a senior planner at Tool Design Group, and Mike Salaberry, a transportation engineer with the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency. My name is Dan Jeline, and I'm the program manager at the Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center. I'll be facilitating today's webinar. Attendees, if you can hear me and if you can hear our speakers, click the hand in the box in the upper right-hand corner of your screen to raise your hands so that we can be sure our audience can hear us. We'll take just a minute to make sure people are all raising their hands. It looks like hands are going up. That's great. Excellent. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We're really excited about the presentation. Before we get started with today's webinar, I want to go over a few administrative details and about the functionality of the webinar software. If for some reason your computer or web browser freezes during the webinar, please reload the website and log back into the program. You should be able to rejoin the session. Please note that attendees will not be able to speak during the webinar. We do expect a large number of attendees on this call, so by muting your audio, that helps us to cut down on confusion and background noise. As an attendee, you have a control box in the upper right-hand corner of your screen that collapses and expands by clicking the double arrows. Though you won't be able to speak, you will have the ability to ask questions by entering them in the question box. If you have a problem during the webinar, you may enter it here. I'll monitor these questions and respond to you if I'm able. Questions pertaining to the presentation may be asked at any time in the question box, but will not be addressed until the end of the program, when we've built in about 20 to 25 minutes for a discussion period. Please feel free to ask those questions as we go along, and we'll get to them after the presentation. Also, when you exit the webinar, there's going to be a very brief survey that will pop up. We would very much appreciate your feedback on our performance. Following today's webinar, you'll receive a follow-up email. This email will include a link to download a printable certificate of attendance for 1.5 hours of instruction. If there are multiple attendees at your site, please forward this link to the other participants so that they can download and print the certificate with their name. This email will also include a link to the website where you can download a PDF copy of the slides from today's presentation. We will also be posting a video archive of this presentation 1 to 2 weeks after the webinar. The webinar has been submitted and approved by the AICP for 1.5 CM credits. The Road Safety Academy, the training and education arm of the UNC Highway Safety Research Center, is a registered provider of CM credits. For more information on the Road Safety Academy, please visit www.rsa.unc.edu. In addition to these webinars, PBIC offers 4 different in-person training courses to provide technical assistance to professionals and community members in developing pedestrian safety action plans and improving conditions for walking. These courses can be found at www.walkinginfo.org/training. Today's webinar will focus on road diets, one of the proven safety countermeasures that the Federal Highway Administration has been promoting. On this slide, you can see a list of all of the FHWA's proven safety countermeasures, along with the focus areas where they belong. Many of the pedestrian-focused countermeasures have been covered in our previous webinars. For more information about road diets and the rest of the proven safety countermeasures, please visit the link on this slide. Now I'm going to turn the screen over to Libby to begin our feature presentation. While she's getting set up with her slides, I'd like to take a quick poll from the audience. Okay, thank you all so much for voting in the poll. We appreciate your feedback. I'd like to welcome and thank all of our presenters for agreeing to speak with us today. Libby, please go ahead and kick things off.
All right, thank you, Dan, and thank you, everyone, for participating. So I want to start right off with a slide to illustrate what we typically mean by a road diet. And people use different terms nowadays for this. This is an example of a classic road diet on your screen, which means a conversion from 4 regular traffic lanes to typically 3 travel lanes, but it could include 5 lanes if you count the 2 bike lanes on either side. And then there's typically a 2-way center turn lane in the middle. Let's So here's an example from Orlando, Florida. This is Edgewater Drive, and this is the before condition with 4 lanes, in this case with parking on either side, lots of driveways. And this is after the road diet was implemented. This is a good case study. I know this example has been presented in some of the earlier training modules, and they have some good data before and after travel, safety measures, speed measures. So it's a great case study to use. But I'm not going to talk a whole lot about case study examples. Here's another type of road diet that could be implemented, which is instead of using just an ongoing two-way turn lane, you can reclaim the space for a median or median island for a refuge for pedestrians. But this study, so there have been a lot of before and after case study comparisons with raw crash frequencies, and some have measured speeds and other measures of effectiveness, as I mentioned. And there have been some operational modeling studies, primarily around the early 2000s. And then recently we've seen some how-to guides and so forth come out. But the focus of my presentation is on the controlled safety evaluations of road diets. So I have the easy part today. I haven't had to have the public meetings and all of those things to get road diets implemented. So once again, a majority of the sites that have been included in evaluations to this point have been the classic types of road diets, from 4 lane to 3 lanes, plus sometimes bike lanes or parking. So this is a list of the studies that received the most attention in my review. There aren't that many of them, as you might notice. The 4 at the top received most of the attention because those were the best controlled evaluations. The 2 at the bottom had some issues with data or comprehending the data and other issues. The Lyle study submitted to Michigan has been a bit controversial because it has generated a lot of discussion because of some conclusions based on their both modeling and operations modeling and safety assessments. But I will just say that in their comparison group, it seems that their study sites were included in the comparison group, so any crash reductions associated with the treated sites could have been included in the comparison group, therefore potentially understating the differences there. So once again, but there are no perfect studies really. There may be no volume data available for studies. There may be imperfectly matched comparison sites, or failure to examine area-wide effects, such as potential spillover, if there's traffic diversion and things like that. But the best studies will try to control for general crash trends over time and changes in traffic volume over time, but without assuming a linear relationship between crashes and volume. We'll also control for other important factors that may vary across time or space through their reference groups and so forth. And we'll control for regression toward the mean. And I'll try to quickly define what that means for those of you who may be unfamiliar with that term. But regression toward the mean is a tendency for locations that have high crash frequencies to go down in a later time just simply due to chance, because on average, their trends will hover around a certain mean number of crashes. Conversely, low crash sites may go up in a future year, and this is so they can go up and down regardless of treatment and so forth. The current state of the art in terms of evaluation studies is empirical Bayes analysis, or even a full Bayes type analysis, which accomplishes all of the objectives of controlling for these various potential confounders very nicely, and it also reduces the level of uncertainty in the error estimates because to use this procedure, a large group of reference sites are typically used to determine a safety performance function for the type of roadway that the treatment is being applied to. And so that's the type of procedure that was used by Harkey et al. In an NCHRP report that that's the study that helped generate estimates for the highway safety manual for a lot of different treatments. Okay, I think that's good. So this is just a summary of the studies that we're focusing on. An interesting thing, though, is that there is a good bit of relationship among all these studies. So can I close that? Let me close that. Excuse me just a moment, everybody. Okay, so, and people can hear me okay. All right. So in the first study, the Huang et al. Study, and Charlie was involved with that one, so he might have some memories about that study. That focused on data from Washington State, some of the Seattle sites, I expect, that you might be talking about today, in California. There were 30 initial sites identified, but they were unable to use all of those at that time because of limitations in study periods and so forth, how long the treatments have been implemented. So they made several kinds of comparisons using the data that were available, and they matched the comparison sites very well. Then Paulovich, that group, I may be pronouncing the name wrong, and I apologize for that if so, had 15 treated sites in Iowa and matched those sites and performed a full days type of analysis. So that's a well-controlled analysis as well. All of those data were later used and reanalyzed in the other study by Harkey et al. And they used the empirical Bayes approach, which means they added a whole lot of reference sites to get better estimates for expected crashes on those types of roads. And so we'll talk about the results. Okay. So this is just a summary of, and this is directly out of the appendix for that report, the Iowa data that were used, and this is for the treated sites. So these are the data that were used by Paulovich and by later reanalyzed by Harkey. So it shows the average numbers of before years of data and so on, and the after periods. The average crashes per mile of roadway in the before period and the after periods. And the traffic volumes, the AADTs before and after. And you can see that the traffic volumes actually increased a little bit on average. This is average data for all of the sites, but there's no indication that traffic diversion was a big problem over this time period, at least judging by just the before and after AADT data. You can also see that just looking at observed crashes, the numbers seem to go down quite a bit. So this is the data for, or these are the data for California and Washington used by Huang, and then also again later in the NCHRP study. And there's a little bit shorter periods of data available for this group, but again, the crashes per mile here went down, not quite as much as in the other set, and the traffic volume data stayed about the same or went up slightly on average. And so what they found, so I'm going to report first on the most recent study, which analyzed with the larger reference groups. And so when they aggregated the data for all of the sites, Iowa, California, and Washington, there was a nearly 30% average crash reduction per site was the estimate. And the standard errors were pretty low, about a little less than 2%. They also performed disaggregate analyses for the sites in California and Washington and the Iowa sites. You may recall from the earlier slide that the volumes, the traffic volume ranges were a little different. And another thing that varied between the Washington, California sites and the Iowa sites is that the population-centered, the traffic, the road diet or conversion sites in Washington and California were in larger urban areas than those in Iowa. So those tended to be kind of like state highways going through smaller towns versus the road-dieted sites in California and Washington. So, and the estimates turned out to be fairly different when they disaggregated the two. So the crash reductions obtained for the sites in Iowa were nearly 50%, about 48% for those areas, the road diets in those segments, and less than 19% for the ones in California and Washington. So they recommended that if you are considering implementing road diets, you tailor your expectations accordingly, that if you have sites that are more comparable to the small towns, you use the estimate for Iowa, and if you have sites that are in larger urban areas, you use the estimates for Washington and California. If it's more general or a variety of types of sites, then just use the aggregate estimate. So the earlier study with using the Iowa data had interestingly come up with a somewhat different estimate, but these estimates aren't exactly measuring the same thing either, so don't focus on that too much. But generally the study of the Iowa data there found a 25% reduction in crashes per mile. So they normalized in the other study, they weighted the segments rather than normalizing on a per mile basis. They weighted by length, and here we had a normalizing on a per mile basis. As I mentioned before, they also used a little bit different analysis procedure, but so that's what they found. Huang et al. In the earlier study did not find much of an effect of road diets. This is using the California and Washington data, but they had a much smaller comparison group, and so perhaps their estimates of expected crashes weren't quite as robust initially as the studies using the larger reference group. And they also didn't find a real difference in the trend between the road diet sites and the comparison sites. But if you remember, the effects were lower in California, and there may be some reasons for that, but at any rate. So the final study I wanted to look at is this one by Chen et al., and I don't think it actually has appeared yet, but it's in press with accident analysis and prevention. It should be coming out shortly, anytime now. And this is a study that actually used a new set of data from New York City, and they had 460 treated segments that received road diets in New York City. And they had a large number of comparison segments, over 3,000. They also decided that perhaps this treatment could have an effect on what happens at the intersections adjacent to the road diet, so they separately analyzed the effect on the adjacent intersections. So with that group, they were able to use 324 of the adjacent intersections. And again, they had a large comparison group for that. Unfortunately, they did not have traffic volume data, so they could not use the empirical base type analysis. But based on the large number of sites, it seems to be a fairly robust study. So this is a summary of the data they had. Again, and the average crashes per site per year for the segments. You can see in the treated locations it went down from about 0.12 on average to 0.05. I forgot I can be pointing to these. There we go. So here we are, the crashes per segment. And then on the comparison group, the crashes actually increased slightly over that time period at segments. The crashes at intersections went down only slightly, and the comparison group for intersections actually went down somewhat more over the same time period. So when they did the controlled comparison, and so they did do a controlled comparison group trend type analysis in their ANCOVA model with the treatment intervention period dividing the before and after time. So they came up with an estimate of about 67% reduction in total crashes. With the standard errors were a little higher than what we saw before, so about 7% there. And a reduction in fatal and injury crashes of 70% with a 9% error for the confidence intervals. They did also find a reduction in pedestrian crashes, but this estimate was not significant. And you can see it has a pretty wide error value there, because generally pedestrian crashes are few in number, so it's really difficult to detect a significant effect on pedestrian crashes, as Charlie can vouch for. So they good things about all of these studies is they did use matched comparison groups, including this study as well. So what they found at intersections, as we saw, interestingly, they did measure a 13% reduction in total crashes on average, and about a 17% reduction in fatal and injury crashes. Both of those were statistically significant, pardon me for stumbling, but again, they could not, there was a 5% increase, although again not significant statistically, in pedestrian crashes. Once again, they did not have volume data, though, including they did not have data for pedestrians. And they also tried to measure effects on bicyclists. I didn't report that here, but it was, again, they could not detect significant effects on bicyclists. But because they lacked exposure data, it could be that more pedestrians were using the street, and that could have had an effect on the crashes at intersections. So finally, picking up a couple of other studies that were not safety evaluations, or that I didn't talk about earlier, the Gates study, for example. These are some studies that had measured speeds, and so that helps us comprehend a little bit of the safety effects of road diets. So some of the studies, the work that Knapp and Gies did in Iowa, again, this is using some of those Iowa locations, and they looked at some case study data for those, and they did have speed data for a number of those locations. So we did tend to see speed reductions on several of those sites, particularly reductions of the higher amounts of speeding. So, and the same with the Gates study from Minnesota. We saw decreases in mean and 85th percentile speeds. So that evidence helps support the safety effects that we found in other studies. I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but the Highway Safety Manual now has estimates for the safety effects of lower speeds. So that's something to check out if you're not aware of that. So some of the other things that Knapp and Gies found is that through both simulation and measured speeds, they, in 63 out of 64 different combinations of access point densities, volume, and turning volume combinations, their models predicted lower speeds for 3-lane versus 4-lane cross sections. And then controlling for these different values, then they found that when access points and turning volumes were lower, there was a greater difference in speeds, which makes sense between the 3 and 4 lane, because vehicles in the left lane of a 4-lane were not having to slow for turning vehicles, whereas in a 3-lane configuration, they move over, but the lead vehicle in the 3-lane kind of sets the pace speed there. So again, with lower turning volumes and fewer access points, the speeds tended to be lower on 3-lane than 4-lane. But with higher volumes in general on the road, higher traffic volumes, speeds would be more often constrained by the vehicle in a single through lane as well. So we saw they saw a greater difference in speed. So through these operational assessments and so forth, and some of the earlier work that people had done, just theoretical work looking at crash types and so forth, they hypothesized when road diets would tend to be effective safety-wise, and some of those details are outlined in many of these other studies, like the I'm losing it. There is a study put together by ITE and published by the Road Diet Handbook. Some of you know, so help me out. My brain is not working right now. Okay.
Rosales.
Somebody?
Rosales.
Yeah, that's right, Rosales. Thank you. Okay. So finally, conclusions from the safety studies. The most robust studies indicate that the total crash reductions are between about 19% and 48%, depending on site characteristics. The reductions in travel speeds support the safety effects observed. And as I mentioned, the Highway Safety Manual shows expected crash reductions for speed reductions of various initial travel speeds. So this is in addition to reductions in conflicts and so forth, the other characteristics of road diets that contribute to crash reductions. And Iowa was an example of that. The Harkey et al. Hypothesized that the Iowa sites had greater speed reductions after their road diets based on some of that older data than the California sites in the larger urban areas. So that may have contributed to the larger safety effects. And finally, as I was trying to describe trying to describe just a minute ago, but there we go, but may not have done a good job. The roads with a lower density of access points and lower turning volumes may observe greater differences in speed, but there may be trade-offs there because of the conflict situation. We also know that high turning volumes and so forth can make a 4-lane road operate more or less like a 3-lane. The roads with the higher volumes may have higher speed differences because of just because they're less constrained by the lanes, the number of lanes. So the higher severity crashes are also maybe significantly reduced as found in the New York City study for segments and intersections. And the effects on pedestrians are more challenging to measure. Unfortunately, the study from New York City is the only one of these robust studies that has attempted to measure effects on pedestrians. But the trends are promising. It looks good for the mid-block crashes.
Great, thank you so much, Libby. That's a great overview, I think, of some of the research and what the research shows. I think what we're going to do now is shift gears and hear from 2 examples of cities that are implementing road diets. So what I'm going to do now is turn it over to Mike Salberry. Mike is a transportation engineer with the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency, and he's going to be talking about some of their experience with road diets. And so, Mike, go ahead and take control and begin whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Salberry. I work for San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency. Been doing the job for about 13 years. I started out as an engineer with the bike program, went over to the traffic calming program and managed that for a little while. And now I am in the livable street section, which works on bicycle, pedestrian, traffic calming streetscape projects. So just give you some a background of my background. And in front of you, you see a picture of San Francisco with Market Street down the middle. It's a more urbanized area. It's got 800,000 people per 47 square miles, so it's one of the more dense cities in the country. So, so for us, space is a premium, and road diets have become a really useful tool for us. And I think you all know a lot of this information. We've done over 50 road diets, and so far I haven't heard of another city that's done more. I mentioned this recently in New York, and no one refuted it. So If anybody knows of a city that's done more than 50, let me know, and I'll modify that statement a bit. So as I mentioned, we're a very dense city, and when you have limited space, you should treat it, it could be treated as a limited resource. And so when you have limited resources, it's a key to use it efficiently. And I think people have seen this photo or a version of this photo that just shows that the same number of people driving versus the same number of people taking the bus versus walking or cycling, you can see the effect on what it does to our limited space. And one of the great things about road diets is that it creates space for complete streets. And we know that complete streets are more comfortable for everyone, but especially for vulnerable road users like pedestrians and cyclists. So when we don't have that space for complete streets, I think we've all felt this in our own cities or other cities, how precarious it can be when you have narrow sidewalks and difficult crossings of major streets. So San Francisco has some ambitious goals. Basically, we want to reduce the use of personal motor vehicles and increase transit, bicycle, and pedestrian trips. This shows all trips in a typical day. Our work trips are pretty good. We're already at more or less 50% bike, pedestrian, and transit use for work trips. But we want to constantly improve that. I'd mentioned that we've done about 50 road diets. This is a map that gives you a sense of the breadth of road diets. We've done them for pedestrian measures, for bicycle measures. We've put in the transit-only lanes, which you see in purple. And I think the ultimate road diets are what you see in red, are where we've actually taken down elevated freeways and replaced them with boulevards. 1989 earthquake here helped expedite that process a bit, and I'll talk a little bit later about those too. So I'm going to focus more on how to implement road diets. I think most people know the benefits, the safety benefits, what we can do with the increased space, but how do we get them in? And first of all, I think a good rule of thumb is that 20,000 vehicles per day. If a street has 20,000 or less, then it's a candidate for a road diet. It also translates to about 1,000 vehicles per hour per direction, and that would qualify a road for a 4-to-3 road diet. The closer you are to 20,000 vehicles per day, the more you have to look at the signal timing and the potential for spillover, but it is a good rule of thumb. One of our key road diets was Valencia Street, done in 1999. And the 20,000 vehicles per day rule of thumb actually applied here. This street used to have 23,000 vehicles per day, and after the road diet, it went down to 20,000. So it played out here. And the reason it worked here, the slight spillover, is because there's parallel arterials to this roadway. So that's something to keep in mind when working on road diets, and you are at that 20,000 vehicle per day threshold, is if there is spillover, where would it go? If you're talking about neighborhood, local streets, that's going to be a problem more than it would be if you have an arterial nearby. So this road diet was done in 1999, and it was controversial. There was a strong demand by bicyclists for this street, but there's also some concerns because we had not done a lot of road diets, and the merchants were concerned about what it would do for business. And so one tool to get around some resistance to road diets, or any project really, is to install it as a trial. And in this case, we promised that we would do a report 6 months after the fact and 1 year after the fact, present the findings, and let our city council decide whether or not to keep it. So I think that's a very useful tool. I would warn that if you are going to do a trial, one, set aside the resources for before and after study, and two, really, anytime you try something new, try it on a street where you're really pretty confident it's going to succeed. Because if you try something that's high profile, it's installed as a trial, and it completely fails, it's going to set you back for a while. Luckily, in this case, Valencia Street turned out to be a great success. There were a lot more cyclists, crashes went down, and the merchants were really in favor of keeping the street as permanent, keeping the trial, making it permanent. And in fact, 10 years later, or 15 years later or so, we go to Valencia Street 2.0, where we retained the road diet, and we actually widened sidewalks, added bulb outs, widened the bike lanes, added street trees, a whole variety of different measures to really improve the street even further. Picture you see in the middle is the green wave. We timed the traffic signals in both directions for 13 miles an hour, which is very good for cycling and also has a great traffic calming effect. We don't want, merchants don't want traffic to simply pass by their store. They want traffic to stop. And if you're going too fast, you won't notice what's happening to your left and to your right. So slower speeds are actually good for business too, and of course for safety. And so I'm going to move fairly quickly through some of these slides, but later on if you want to look at some of the reports that we've written about these trials, there's a whole era of trials. Early on with the road diets, we did 4 trials within a 2-year period. But you can see 4 here, and if you go to our website, sfmta.com/bikes, click on reports and studies, you can see some of the before and after studies we've done. And as the years have progressed, we got better and better at doing these studies, and so I think you can see some of the information collected and apply that to your own city as appropriate. And people sometimes are skeptical and say, oh, you say it's a trial, but it's going to be in permanently. Well, there was at least one trial that did not go as planned. And so it's always, I think you learn the most from your mistakes, but if possible, it's always better to learn from other people's mistakes. So in our case, we made the mistake, and what we did is we misjudged the amount of spillover, and what happened is traffic spilled over into neighborhood streets. So a lot of the residents understood why we did the project. We had very narrow lanes. People were parking on the sidewalks. It was just kind of a messy situation out there. But they didn't see the benefits, and what they saw were a lot of the spillover negated what little benefits we had. So eventually, we actually restored the street back to 4 lanes. So I think it's very important to understand the context of the project and see what is the true demand for a trial or a road diet. Alamany is one street where we performed a road diet. It's a 6-lane street. You can see in the bottom left, 6 lanes with parking and a 4-foot wide median. And what these slides show is snippets from our outreach. And so it includes some of the arguments that we used to help convince what was a very skeptical neighborhood about this road diet. In the end, it turned out to work well. The street was way over capacity. And you can see how we try to sell the project, the benefits for pedestrians, the benefits for bicyclists, and a lot of benefits for motorists. High speeds are dangerous for everybody, but we also try to sell to the neighborhood by saying your exits from driveways will be easier because traffic is pushed away from the driveways and from the park lanes. Getting to your parking spot will be easier, and you have more space to park your car. So this was just trying to show everyone the multiple benefits associated with a road diet. Here's a picture of it. The numbers are a little bit outdated, but it's from an older slide, and you can see some of the grayed out lines that show where the old striping was. So what we have is a wider median. We have 2 lanes, bike lane, and wider parking lane. And with the numbers were very promising in this time period with lower speeds, lower pedestrian crashes, and there was one more bicycle crash, but the usage was up a lot more, so the overall rate dropped for bicyclists too, crash rates. I'll touch on a couple other projects really quickly. This is just another example of how a road diet significantly lowered speeds and especially collisions. In this particular case, collisions went down 84%. So again, just more evidence of how these are very useful projects. Another argument to use sometimes if you have a skeptical populace or a merchants group is that more and more I'm seeing studies that show that people actually pedestrians and people who use bicycles actually spend more over a month or so than people who drive. The drivers may spend more at each visit, but they may not visit as often. So this was one report that was done for Columbus Avenue in San Francisco. And I think it should serve as, it could provide compelling evidence for how this could be beneficial for business. And I'll finish or focus more on Cesar Chavez Street, which is our latest road diet and one of our biggest. It's a 6-lane roadway, and it has 53,000 vehicles a day. And here's a picture from a pedestrian overpass showing what the street looks like. Pretty barren landscaping-wise. It's very wide. You see some people parking on the sidewalk because they're afraid to get sideswiped. You even have freeway scale signage on the street. It's just not a very pleasant street to walk along, bike along, or cross. So we're focusing on improving safety there. And these are just some old pictures. It actually used to be a 2-lane roadway you look at the picture on the top left, that's two-lane roadway with parking, and then the bottom toward the right of that picture is how the street was being widened. So a lot of people may have issues with change, but change is constant, and sometimes you're trying to, the change you're promoting is actually to bring it back closer to what it used to be. So it's a really interesting project, and it's under construction now. And part of it was that it's just kind of miserable to walk along, especially. And you can see these are 3 classic scenarios that you run across: people parking on the sidewalk, which is fairly narrow. You know, one transit shelter will block it. And you can see on the bottom right, I mean, that's one of the pedestrian crossings. And it's kind of daunting when you have 4 lanes of traffic in this particular intersection approach, or 3 lanes, and just a lot of asphalt to cover. And so there's a strong desire by the neighborhood to do something about it. This turned out to be a multi-agency effort. So as the street was being torn up for sewer projects, rather than rebuild it the way it was, it turned out to be a great opportunity to try to add many different amenities. And so ultimately there were four agencies involved, and it's just a lot of coordination. These dates are a little bit out of date because of schedule changes, but it kind of shows the various projects and departments that were involved in trying to make this happen over a 4-year period. So lots of design considerations. You know, obviously pedestrians, bicyclists, you have to think about truck turning templates, the signal design, accessibility. There's schools and parks on each side of the street. We also have transit along the street. This street leads to a freeway, so you have local and regional traffic. And just building the street, just building the streetscape project is challenging because you have to close off lanes to build the bulb outs and the medians, and how do you deal with the traffic routing during that? And what we had to do was take a lot of traffic volume data, collect a lot of traffic volume data around the neighborhood on streets where we suspected there would be spillover traffic. So it's always good to have in case people say, oh, there's more spillover or higher speeds. You can say objectively if that's true or not. So here's the basic cross sections of what we're proposing. Top shows 6 lanes with parking on each side, narrow median, and then the bottom result is mid-block section will have 4 lanes of traffic with a median. At some intersections, that median will turn into a turn pocket. And when striping bike lanes, we try to go with wider parking lanes because people open their doors. We don't want it to block the bike lane. And so when people talk about, I'll try to explain this diagram, but the green line is basically the amount of traffic per hour over a 24-hour period. So you can see that there's a peak period around 4 to 6 p.m., and then there's a smaller peak period around 8 a.m. And so what you have is that shows the vehicles per hour, and you can see the peak period. And in this case, in Cesar Chavez's case, street, this peak period with the road diet is going to bring us to level service F. So I think this is an interesting project because we as a city have decided that, yes, it's going to be level service F, but this is worthwhile. And a part of the argument is that, you know, it's only 1 or 2 hours a day, and through a vast majority of time, there's tons of unused capacity. So the need for safety improvements, for more pedestrian, bicycle, transit measures made it a compelling reason. But I think this graph is very typical of a street with the 2 peaks, one being larger than another. So this argument could be used for streets in your city. So when you design for a peak hour, if you want to get level service, you know, B or C at all times of day, including the peak hour, what you end up with is most of the time a lot of empty lanes, and that encourages speeding. And frankly, it's just a really inefficient use of what's valuable space, especially in many of our cities and towns and cities. So you can see, like, if you're on this road, it's going to be very difficult to stay at the 25-mile-per-hour speed limit. And, you know, as a pedestrian, look at all these lanes and this asphalt that you have to cross, especially if you are a person with disabilities, a child, senior. This is a daunting street to cross. So at the bottom, you can see the asterisk says a peak hour occurs only more or less 2 hours a day, 5 days a week. And that's 6% of the time. So people often say about road diets that this project is going to create congestion. And if you're near that 20,000 vehicle per day threshold for a 4 to 3 road diet, that may be the case. But one argument is that you may have congestion 6% of the time, but these are for benefits that will be there 24/7. And I think that becomes compelling. And again, if you're new to road diets, that do a few successful, easy examples. And so create a pattern of showing people that these work. And for Valencia Street, which is shown here, it really opened the floodgates for us, that people saw how great it was. It got a lot of press, and we've been going gangbusters since then. And one consideration too, if you have transit on the street and there's going to be some congestion, is that you can use what are called bus bulb outs. And that allows the bus to not have to exit the travel lane, but they can stay in the lane, stop all the traffic behind it, and when they pick up their passengers, continue straight without having to pull back into the traffic stream. These have multiple benefits. They widen the sidewalk at the corner, they shorten the crossing distance, and again, they help transit. They reduce the effect of congestion on transit. One project that I think will be very exciting is Masonic, and this is a $20 million project that has been conceptually designed. We're looking for funding. This road die is going to go from what's basically 6 lanes to 4 lanes and provide raised cycle tracks. So we want to get a higher level, higher standard of bicycle accommodation, but also improve safety for pedestrians and improve operations for transit. I think it's going to be an exciting project, and I think in the next year or two we'll hear more about how this is progressing. We often talk about road diets taking space away from motor vehicle travel lanes, but I'll throw out there that you can also convert parking spaces, or that parking lane could be used more efficiently. In this case, San Francisco's done a lot of parklets, and I tell you, if you have a lot of unemployed architects out there coming out of college, they love these things. We're doing tons of parklets. What they are basically is you take out a couple parking spaces and you replace it with a 6-foot wide deck. And it's really, really impressive how creative people are with that space. And it's been used so heavily. And I think this is something you see also in New York, where they've converted some of their excess pavement to parks. But there's just a strong demand for outdoor seating, for more greenery. Bike parking, you can put it on these parklets instead of on the sidewalk. And this has been a huge success. And also what we've been doing is creating on-street bicycle parking. And this is another example of using limited space more efficiently. Generally, 1 car space is enough room for 10 to 12 bicycles. And not only are you providing more efficient use of that space, you're also clearing the sidewalk for pedestrians. And that's very important, I think, especially in the top right photo at our main library. That was the impetus for this project back, I think it was 6, 7, 8 years ago, where we removed a lot of the bike parking that was on the sidewalk and really narrowed the sidewalk. So again, these are great programs, and they're all requested by fronting business owners. So I think just the fact that we've been getting so many requests for these bike corrals, for these parklets, show that they're working, that people want them. They're willing to trade away the parking spot in front of their business for these sorts of amenities. I'd mentioned the ultimate road diet of taking down elevated freeway. It's not something we do every day, but just one example is the Embarcadero on the top right. You can see what the waterfront freeway used to look like. Not exactly the most aesthetically pleasing structure in the world. And so the freeway damaged it, and there was a big push to replace it with a boulevard, and you can see directly under it what it looks like today. And it's been, I think this is one of our great examples of a complete street because it has wide sidewalks, it has room for bicyclists, transit in the median, lots of parks, public spaces. It's just a much better environment. It connects the waterfront with the urban core. It's been a great success. These are just some photos from the street itself, some of the art. We have a popular farmers market, some of the transit that's on the street. So a lot of these projects, they're great for the street itself, they're great for business, but they're also in tune with what our goals are for affecting a shift in how people get around the city. We're not saying one way of getting around the city is the only way to get around. We want to give people choices on how they travel around the city. You shouldn't have to be brave to go walk to a destination or to use a bicycle. And I think all these projects that we've been doing throughout the years have shown that in this graph that bicycling, walking, and public transit have all shown relative increases in their mode share since 2002. And carpooling and driving alone have decreased. So these are really promising trends. We want to continue on this route and give people quality choices that are safe and enjoyable. And I think with that, just want to say thank you and pass it on to the next presenter.
Great, thank you, Mike. Really appreciate that. We're going to go ahead right now and turn it over to Jenna to give a presentation on the experience in Seattle. Jenna, go ahead and take control whenever you're ready.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. So my name is Jenna Kaufman, and I am a planner with Tool Design Group. I did work for the City of Seattle for 5 years in the pedestrian and bicycle program, and was involved in implementing both the bicycle and pedestrian master plans, and did quite a few road diet projects. And as Mike mentioned with San Francisco, Seattle is also a very dense city, and there's not a lot of opportunity to build out. Seattle is a gold level bicycle friendly community, and I have to say the only platinum level walking friendly city in the country. And citizens have also passed a levy to fund bicycle and pedestrian projects. So I say this because even in a community that values walking and bicycling based on these awards and dedicated funding, road diets are still challenging no matter what city you're in. There's just a lot of data and outreach that has to be accounted for. So just a little bit of history. Seattle has implemented 34 road diets, about 33 miles worth, and we've been doing that for the last 40 years or so. We've really accelerated the number of road diets over the past 3 years to meet our complete streets goals. So just a little bit of background, like San Francisco, Seattle has a complete streets approach to all of our roadway projects. These are just some factors that go into the planning and development of each roadway project. We have an initiative that kind of sets the vision. There are multimodal plans that plan for improvements throughout the city. We have dedicated funding, as I mentioned. And each project goes through a complete streets checklist, which each project manager and team will go through as they design a project. We also have a significant outreach component to each project, and most of this is happening through redesigning streets. So this is a street that was one of the first road diet projects in Seattle in the 70s. And as you can see, it's a thriving business district. It was a 4-lane to 3-lane conversion, now has shared lane markings. But I just wanted to show this as an example of, in 40 years, this has really become a thriving place. The traffic volumes have actually increased on the street. It was originally 19,000 and went up. It is now at 22, and it's still functioning beautifully as a complete street. And we know from national surveys, Mike kind of touched on this, that a lot of trips are under 3 miles within most urban areas. And what we're really trying to do is to shift those trips to walking, biking, and transit trips, because most of these short trips are driven. Also, just kind of building on the idea of thriving business districts, WalkScore, which is based in the Seattle metro area, found that for every 1 point increase in the 100-point walkability scale, each point is associated with an increase in home values between $500 and $3,000. So we're really trying to promote walkability in our urban villages. We did a study a couple of years ago to kind of look at how residents in neighborhoods are traveling to their neighborhood business districts. And if you look to the right of the red line, the yellow, green, and brown are all active transportation trips, so bus, light rail, walking, and biking. So it's not necessarily related to road diets, but we are seeing that citizens are choosing other modes than driving to get to their business districts. And because in Seattle a lot of our business districts are on arterial streets, we really want to improve safety along those roadways, which leads to road diets. So I'm just kind of going through some reasons we do road diets. Libby talked a lot about this, reduction in lanes Seattle has done a lot of fairly traditional road diets, whether it's 4 to 3 lanes. It may or may not have bike lanes and parking, but we find that kind of the #1 reason is for pedestrian safety. When you can reduce the number of lanes, you really can make some significant improvements for pedestrians. This is also covered, but fewer collisions. Road diets are a proven safety measure, reducing collisions by 29%. And the 2 examples here are roadways. One, Marginal Way, which is along the Port of Seattle, which is mostly a freight and bicycle route. And the other is Nickerson Street on the right there, where we were able to install some median crossing islands and improve some areas where there had been several pedestrian fatalities. This is a great graphic just to illustrate how reduction in speed along a roadway affects pedestrian safety. You can see between 30 and 40 miles an hour, there's a significant change in the number of pedestrians who would be killed if hit. And then we have a bicycle master plan, and it has been we've been aggressive in implementing it, and you can see in the red and blue bars that we started out by doing more projects that were low-hanging fruit, where they were easier projects on roadways that may have width. But as we got several years out in implementation, projects became more challenging, and there were more projects that required parking removal and travel lane reduction. So that explains part of the reason that we've accelerated the number of road diets. So the next couple slides, I'm going to talk about some projects where we have implemented road diets and then gone back, studied the roadway, and made additional changes. So like Mike mentioned, a 2.0 approach to road diets. We've been able to do that through our Complete Streets approach. So this is an example of a street that was originally a 4-lane roadway, converted to a 3-lane roadway, and then through the bicycle master planning process, which recommended bike lanes on the street, we restudied it and found that there weren't as many turning movements on the roadway. So we replaced the center turn lane, that space, with bike lanes, which doesn't necessarily provide, or doesn't change the exposure time of pedestrians crossing the street. This is another example of a road diet that was re-dieted, and it's an example of a lane diet where the roadway was 3 lanes and bike lanes were recommended for the roadway. So we reduced the size of the lane widths to accommodate bike lanes. And the new AASHTO guide does provide a range of lane widths kind of depending on the condition. So you can narrow lane widths to accomplish your goals of multimodal accommodation. Another couple of projects that Seattle has launched is improving transit service on road-dieted roadways. This is the street that I live on, and it was originally 4 lanes, and in the 80s converted to 3 lanes. And just in the last couple of weeks, rapid bus service has been added. Where those parked cars are is now a dedicated bus lane during peak hour, and that's a shared bus-bike lane with a climbing bike lane on the other side. So the road diet enabled some flexibility in providing for transit. Another example where a road dieted road was improved for transit and bicycles was Dexter Ave. Dexter was road dieted several years ago, and through a repaving project, the street was reevaluated. It's a really high volume bicycle corridor and also has high transit use. So in order to accommodate transit and bicycles, a buffered bicycle lane was implemented, and floating bus islands. And you can kind of see how, based on these before and after photos, how the crossing distance for pedestrians is greatly reduced. So really an improvement there for transit riders. So there, like I've just talked about, there are many positive reasons to support road diets, but they're also they're not always appropriate in all contexts. So I just wanted to go through some of the pitfalls that can often lead to failed road diets, and this is, you know, a news story that no one wants to have aired regarding your project. So some of the pitfalls are you don't do a before and after study. As Mike mentioned, it's really important to have data to support primarily your research or your outreach, but it helps to have some indication both before and after the project. Another issue or pitfall is that the signal timing is not right. If there are a lot of signals along a corridor, it's really important to go ahead and do the study and spend the money to optimize the signals. And another issue is the public outreach. It's not done. Road diets are really counterintuitive, and you really need to get buy-in from neighbors and businesses. There's really something kind of illogical in saying that we're taking a lane without improving capacity. Or excuse me, while improving capacity. So making sure that the public understands what you're doing is really critical. And as Mike mentioned also, it's important to do a project that's that's going to be a success. Don't do your hardest project first. So switching gears a little bit to how Seattle has done it over the years. We identify corridors based primarily on prioritization process from our bicycle and pedestrian master plans. And there are a whole bunch of different factors, but they may include safety, connectivity, adjacent land use, car ownership, public health factors, and pavement conditions, just to name a few. We've also done a couple that have actually been requested by communities. And then a lot of our projects are implemented through capital improvement projects. We do a lot in coordination with repaving projects. They're often funded by Bike and Ped funding. And then we're also working very, very closely with King County Metro, our transit agency. So just to go quickly through some of the factors that we consider when we look at a roadway, we kind of have 3 tiers. The first is traffic operations. We look at the traffic volume. If it's 15,000 vehicles, we'll usually move forward with a road diet. If it's 15,000 to 20,000, it will require an evaluation. And if it's over 20,000, it's a maybe and will really require a lot more evaluation. Other factors include peak period, as Mike mentioned, upwards of 1,000 vehicles per hour per day. We look at right and left turning movements, pedestrian and bicycle volumes, and signals. Also, driveways and turning movements are critical factors to look at as well. The second tier is safety. We look at whether the corridor has a high number of vehicular, pedestrian, or bike crashes and how that compares to other arterials of similar volumes. And we also look at the speeds of vehicles, whether or not they're higher than the posted speed limit. And then back to livability. I should say livability and walkability. We tend to choose streets that are in commercial districts, areas where you want lower speeds, have higher multimodal use, where you want less noise, and are more aesthetically pleasing. So those are factors that, streets that are either historic streets or main streets, those sorts of places are good candidates for road diets. So this is just a list of common studies that we would do for a project, and we don't apply these to every project, but this would be, this would be a corridor with a lot of signals if we were to do all of these studies. And we'll do an after study within a year of the original road diet. So you can really use data to counter some of the common concerns you'll hear from the public. There will be gridlock. You want to be able to show that you can maintain capacity at signalized intersections. Another common concern is people will cut through the neighborhood. You definitely want to monitor pre- and post-project implementation. Often we'll look at adjacent streets and monitor those volumes and install traffic calming if necessary. And then explain how road diets work, that site distance is improved so that people won't actually be stuck in their driveways. This is an example of two projects that were implemented a couple of years ago, and this just shows kind of the upfront interest in the project based on the comments that came in from the public and then the comments after. And there's a lot of interest in the beginning, and then people are generally pretty happy with it. The top project was a rechannelization in a business district, and there was a neighborhood group that kind of rallied against it, and you can see in the lower right they made yard signs against the project. Another community group kind of retaliated and started sending collision images to various blogs. So we really there were definitely two camps, but you can see there were only 3 requests to remove the road diet at the end. People liked it. So I'll just go through really quickly a couple of case studies just to illustrate kind of how we go about our studies and what some of the outcomes are. This is Stoneway, which was the first project that we implemented for the bicycle master plan, although it had a lot of pedestrian improvements as well. It's a roadway that connects a major regional trail to a regional park, and as you can see has a lot of schools and connects kind of a barrier between a neighborhood. The roadway also had several uncontrolled marked crosswalks, and those were going to have to be removed based on new guidelines. And so in order to maintain the marked crosswalks, a road diet was of interest. Bicycle Master Plan recommended a climbing lane and shared lane markings on the roadway. This posted speed limit was 30 miles an hour. Before the road diet was implemented, speeds were fairly high. The 85th percentile was 37 miles per hour, and we saw a slight decrease after. And I would say that's consistent with some of the research that Libby highlighted. What we did see was a significant reduction in aggressive speeders. The black line on the graph represents the before study and the red line the after, and you can see several percentage points difference in the number of people traveling over 40 miles an hour, which significantly reduces injury collisions. And what was really exciting about this project was the increase in bicycles. At peak hour, there's a 15% of the peak hour traffic volume was bicycles, so quite a latent demand there. We also saw that ADTs dropped, and that was consistent with the citywide ADT numbers, and we also saw a decrease in peak hour traffic volumes. What was interesting is we didn't see an increase in 4 adjacent roadways that would be used as cut-throughs. So overall volumes decreased, and there was not any diversion after the project. So this just shows the decrease in collision types. We did, if you notice, we did see more rear-end collisions, and that was likely due to some complications with a transition from 4 to 3 lanes, where left-turning vehicles were likely having an issue. But otherwise, we saw a decrease in all types of other collisions. There we go. So to conclude with this case study, speeds declined, collisions declined, pedestrian crossings were improved, bicycle volumes increased, and there was no additional diversion to adjacent streets. So it was a strong case for implementing a road diet. Real quickly, I'll go through one more case study here. This is a little bit different kind of street. This is at much higher volume. It's a roadway that went through a business district and had high transit usage, and it also had a high number of pedestrian collisions. Again, the bigger numbers were the reduction in top-end speeders. This is a roadway that had all the interest from the public. This is an image of a public meeting that had over 100 participants, but overall, top-end speeds were reduced while ADT increased. So this is just a chart of some of the more recent road diets we've completed, and some of the more significant numbers are, again, reduction in top-end speeders. We also calculated travel time, which was a figure that was helpful for the public to understand what the roadway was going to feel like after it was rechannelized. Northeast 125th, the second line, we had an increase in about 1.5 minutes during peak hour, but we actually had a decrease in transit times. And that's the high number for all vehicles was due to some in-lane bus stops. And this is just a kind of to finalize. We've started to go through and look at some of the data from all 30 road diets. And this is one number we've come up with so far, which is that an average change in ADT over those 30 road diets was just 2%. So we're really not seeing a significant change in ADTs based on rechannelizations. And with that, I think I'm done and we can move on to questions.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. I really appreciated both yours and Mike's and Libby's presentations. We have some time for questions now, so I want to go ahead and get to those. What I've got, though, before we get started with questions, we certainly won't get to all of them. We had quite a few. And so if your question isn't answered, I have the email addresses for our presenters up on the screen today. We'll hopefully, if you have some follow-up questions, we can take those if they weren't answered. But what we'll do is get right into it here. One question that came up quite a bit that I'll pose to you all, specifically Jenna and Mike, a question about how you've dealt or worked with local freight companies and to look at how the road diets will impact truck traffic. That can also be said for maybe working with emergency vehicles and also things like garbage trucks and other large vehicles that need maybe some wider lanes or would like to have wider lanes and more lanes. So could you all talk about how you've worked with those groups before your implementation of road diets?
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Yeah.
Do you want to start, Gina? Or?
Sure, I can start. We work very closely with the freight community as well as transit. And generally it comes down to lane width. We really try to do, if it is a freight corridor, do a 12-foot wide lane. On major transit routes, we tend to design 11-foot lanes. But if it's a low-volume transit corridor, we may go down to 10 feet. So it really, the issue tends to be lane width. However, we do have freight routes that we understand that freight needs to move around the region, and so we're not always prioritizing those roadways as road diets, but for those that do have low volumes, it's like that image I showed earlier with a road dieted roadway right adjacent to the port. It is working well in certain situations, but it really comes down to the characteristics of the roadway.
Yeah, I agree. We generally start in San Francisco with a 10-foot starting point for lane width, and then we'll widen it as necessary. Most of our road diets are actually adjacent to painted bike lanes and painted medians. So that's a consideration, too, is that you don't have a hard edge on each side or even one side of the lane. so you can get away with narrower lanes in some situations. On Valencia Street, especially the recent work, we worked with the Teamsters Union rep to identify where trucks need to stop to load and unload. And what we found was a lot of the existing yellow zones were either too short or not properly located or too numerous or not enough. And so we were afraid that trucks were going to start parking in the bike lane, and we actually reorganized the yellow zones, working closely with them, and find that the double parking is not too bad, actually. Regarding emergency vehicles, I forgot to mention that's another benefit of road diets, is that if you have an emergency vehicle, a lot of times that motor vehicle traffic can move over into the bike lane, and the emergency vehicles can go right down the middle of the lane and middle of the roadway in the two-way left turn lane or alongside the cars that have pulled over. So we find that the police department and paramedics actually support these road diet projects, or at least they don't impose it. We'll say that.
Okay, great, thank you. This next question is specifically from Mike in San Francisco. Did the road diets that you implemented have any impact on your overhead trolley lines, having to move those at all?
Let's see. In one instance they did, on Potrero Avenue, where we had left-turning trolleys. But generally we're talking about shifting the trolleys over 5 feet or so, and that's usually within the range of the trolley. So we do keep that in mind when we do shift trolleys. We're mindful of where the lines are with respect to their travel path. But we don't have to shift the lines too often.
Okay, great, thank you. One other question for both of you. When you implement your road diets, what widths are you typically using for your center turn lane? I know you had a couple of diagrams up, but if you could give some ranges that you typically are using for that, and specifically if you've done anything under 10 or 11 feet. There were a couple of questions asked about very narrow center turn lanes.
For us, 10 feet is generally the minimum. Depending on the traffic, you might want to have it a little bit wider. I think we might have an example of one under 10 feet, but I'd have to dig into our striping drawings. I'd say 10 feet is a good minimum to aim for. Average car width is 6.5 to 7 feet wide. So if whatever that's worth, trucks are generally 8.5, 9 feet wide.
And that's consistent with what we do in Seattle. We do have a couple 9-foot lanes, but generally they're 10 or 11.
Okay, great, thanks. One of the issues or questions that was asked a few times relates to bicyclists riding in the door zone. And so after some of your road diets were implemented, you probably had bike lanes alongside on-street parking where there may not have been bike lanes before. What have you done surrounding maybe education or other measures to reduce conflicts of cyclists riding in the door zone in your newly implemented road diets?
Something we've tried is, well, first we try to get as much width in the parking lane as possible. We like to aim for a 9-foot minimum parking lane width alongside a bike lane. And in some situations where we've gone less than that, we've actually put markings in what would be the door zone, so kind of a buffer so that it's a visual cue to cyclists that they shouldn't be riding there. So that's one approach, and we're taking data before and after to see if that's effective or not. But I recommend, first of all, try to get your parking lane at least 9 feet first. And we find that it doesn't affect where motorists park relative to the curb. Even if you have a wide parking lane, they'll park up against the curb.
Mm-hmm. In Seattle, a typical parking lane is 7 feet, and we'll widen the bike lane if there's room out to 6 feet. We did at one point test a sign in areas where there was more possibility for dooring, a look for bike sign, which had some good results. But generally, if we can get in a wider bike lane, we'll try to do that.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you talk a little bit, you both spoke about sort of reaching out to doing some outreach with local businesses, citizen groups, transit agencies, those types of groups. Can you both give some specific examples of specific things you've done with certain groups, whether they be businesses or citizen groups, so the types of outreach you're doing? Are you doing sort of surveys and talking to them one-on-one, or are you holding meetings and asking them to to attend? Are you generating specific numbers to share with them at other community meetings? What sorts of things have you done in that area?
Well, I'd say all of the above. It depends on the project. Some projects are slam dunks, not a big deal. A little bit of outreach to the neighborhood group, city council members enough. But we're getting more and more as we, pick the low-hanging fruit and the medium-height fruit. We're getting to the really, really high fruit now, and we're reaching out to, we're going to existing meetings of neighborhood groups. So we're not necessarily asking them to attend a meeting at first. So we go to their meetings, we explain the project, get some feedback. Then we'll hold a project-specific meeting in addition to going to specific meetings. We'll meet, if there's a key individual or group, we'll meet with them more than once. We try to collect, hear their concerns as much as possible, collect data before and after that reflects it, modify the designs, try to find where there's a lot of collaboration, where there's common ground. A lot of times we hear, concerns that we hadn't thought of, and we'll add that element to the project even though it wasn't in the original scope. Like I said before, collect a lot of before and after data if you think it's going to be controversial, and yeah, just be really open and transparent and spend a lot of time listening, especially up front and when developing your designs.
And just to add to that, found it pretty helpful to provide information online for people. So frequently asked questions are really helpful. Graphics to kind of show what the roadway is going to look like. So having those resources available to people so they can sift through the information if they really want to get into the details, in addition to everything that Mike mentioned.
Great, thank you so much. There's a question regarding routes that you maybe targeted for road diets, but where the signalized intersections may be a bit more tightly spaced, or a lot of concentration of signalized intersections. Do you sort of have guidance or thresholds that you use when you look at potential road diets when you may not consider a road if the signals are too closely placed?
We haven't run into that concern. One consideration when you have signals that are closely spaced is that the amount of queuing space or storage space you have for cars stopped at a red light drops. And that is a result of road diet that sometimes people don't think about, is that it's not so much capacity through the intersection, but when you do have a red light, instead of having 2 lanes for people to queue in, now you only have 1. So if you do have closely spaced signals, then you can have traffic spilling back into the previous signal. So in that situation, just make sure that you have decent progression and that you try to mitigate, you can try to meter traffic upstream if that's the case. But yeah, that is something to be mindful of. We haven't rejected a road diet because of closely spaced signals, though.
Okay, great. And one final question here. I'm going to wrap it up after this. This is sort of an interesting question for you all. Coming from the city perspective, we have questions from some citizens and other advocates on the webinar who want to know, speaking from your perspective, if a citizen wants to engage and convince public works departments that road diets are a good idea or to consider road diets, what are some tactics you would recommend? What are some tools that would help citizens sort of speak to individuals in your positions in other places across the country?
Well, I have actually one really specific example of a citizen who did that, and she was successful in getting road diet and bike lanes on a street called Guerrero and San Jose Avenue. And in fact, she went to become one of the, to work for our mayor as one of his transportation go-to people. So it can be done. And so what I would say is I have a compelling reason for why there needs to be a road diet, whether it's traffic concerns, safety concerns, and also build up a coalition of people, neighbors in the area, find partner groups, other neighborhood groups that support you, and be persistent. And I think actually persistence is important for everybody involved. If you care about these things, you're going to run into a lot of resistance at times, and persistence pays off tremendously. And in this case, this one example, the resident was very calm, was very persistent, and really just reasonable. And so I think she was great at building coalitions, getting a lot of excitement behind the project, and she just stuck with it, and the road diet went in.
I don't have a whole lot to add to that.
Okay, great. Well, that's fine. We are just about out of time, so I would like to close off the questions for now. Again, if you do have remaining questions, and I know that there were many that may not have been answered, we hope that you'll follow up and hopefully you can get the information that you need. We'll try to coordinate with the presenters to have links to all of the reports and some of the other things we mentioned, some of the reports that Libby discussed in her first presentation. We'll try to link to all that on our webinar archive page. Just as a reminder, you can access that archive page by visiting the link at the top of the slide right here. We're also going to be sending out a link to the archive page in the automatic email that's going to go to all of you who registered for the webinar. If you registered and you've got other attendees at your site, don't forget to forward that email to them, because that's also going to contain the link to where the place where people can download their own certificate of participation in the webinar, a link to our archive page. We're going to be posting, we've already posted the slides, we're going to be posting the video and recording for the webinar. And so, again, if you want to find that information, you can go to walkinginfo.org/webinar, as follow the link on this page, or wait for that email to come through. I do want to remind everyone that a very brief survey, when you exit the webinar, a brief survey will appear. We really appreciate you taking some time to fill out that survey, let us know what you thought about the webinar, you tell us your thoughts on maybe future webinars, things like that. We're always looking for new ideas, and we always appreciate your feedback. And so I just want to say thank you again to our speakers, Libby Thomas, Jenna Kaufman, and Mike Salaberry. Thank you all for attending today's pedestrian-focused webinar, and we hope everyone has a happy holiday. Thank you.